At AxGen, we're decoding genomes to help benefit athletes. So imagine one athlete has in their DNA genetic markers indicating increased risk for a type of injury, maybe a shoulder injury. But another athlete would have DNA markers indicating a risk for an ankle injury. What we'd like to do is inform these athletes about their inherent risk of injuries while they are still healthy so that they can modify their training regimens and take precautionary steps to help prevent the injuries. So currently, a team of athletes is treated the same. And so you don't know which athletes are at risk for which injuries. And they undergo the same types of training regimens similarly. But what if you could inform the trainer or the coach about which athletes were at risk for which injuries? And so one athlete might be at risk for an ankle injury, the other one at risk for a shin splint. And knowing that this athlete was at risk for shin splints, you could modify their training regimens because there are many, many ways to reduce your risk for shin splints. And this information then would be applied in a smart way to each individual athlete and thereby reduce this high risk down towards this through exercises and rehabilitation treatments. So here's an overview of your genetics to get you started. Recall that your DNA is contained in chromosomes, and you have chromosomes come in pairs, one from your father, one from your mother. Chromosomes are made up of many, many, many different genes. And so here are pictures of genes. They come in different lengths, and some of them point left to right, other ones point right to left. Genes are the things that make proteins, and proteins are encode muscle proteins like myosin and actin. They could encode collagens, which make up your ligaments and tendons, or they might be enzymes, like the enzyme that metabolizes away caffeine after you drink coffee. These genes are thousands of nucleotides long, so if you dial in to the individual nucleotide level, here's a sequence of DNA made up of the 4 nucleotides, G, C, A, and T. The DNA from your dad is shown up at the top, mom is on the bottom, and here's a spot where it's different, like your dad gave you a C and your mom gave you an A. So sometimes that makes a difference, and if it does, then we're using that as a genetic difference for your risk of injury, and when it does, we're going to use that as a genetic marker that's inherent in you that tells you about your risk of injury. So the idea is that we took 100,000 people and we split them into cases and controls for all the different types of injuries. So for example, cases might be a knee injury, MCL injury. And we're looking for one spot in your whole genome where there's differences between cases and controls. So if the spot in the DNA is different, it's called a single nucleotide polymorphism. Polymorphism just means it's different sometimes between people, G's and A's for this polymorphism. And we're looking for a polymorphism where there tend to be one nucleotide in the people with injuries, but the other nucleotide in the people that don't get injured. So here you can see there are more G's in the people with this hypothetical injury, and here there are more A's in the people that don't get injured. So if you have a G, you're more likely to get injured, and if you have an A, you're less likely to get injured, and that's what we mean by a genetic marker. So MCL ligament injury is one of the tests that we provide. MCL is on the inside of your knee. It can be a very serious injury for you as an athlete. And this is what we saw. We saw in your DNA, there was one spot that was polymorphic, and it mattered what nucleotide you got. So it's a single nucleotide polymorphism. These things are all named RS with a long number after that. So this just specifies a specific spot in your genome, like chromosome 3, nucleotide 592. So you go to that spot and you just ask, do I see a C or do I see an A? And it was for MCL injury, it made a difference. So people that had two C's tended to had MCL injury at 1.5%, but people that had an A had an injury at 3%. And this is statistically significant. So then we're going to say having an A means that there's a 106% increased risk for MCL injury. And you can see that graphically here. So here's the marker I just told you about. If you have a single A, you go from 1x injury to 106 times. If you had this other marker, which is some other spot in your DNA, you go up about 60%. Both of these markers are kind of rare, so it could happen, but it'd be very rare to have both markers, in which case we think you'll have an even higher risk of MCL injury. Now, the other kind of thing you will see in AxGen is a polygenic risk score. So two of our tests, caffeine usage and bone mineral density stress fracture, we had such good data that we had many, many, many different polymorphisms that were informative. So that meant that here's your sequence, and there was not just one place where you're different, there were many, many places where you're different. So here are 4 shown in this case. Each one, there's a risk allele, so each of these are associated with stress fracture, or in another case, there could be stress associated with coffee usage. And we don't have to just look at these one at a time. We could make a running total of whether you have a risk allele at SNP1 and a risk allele at SNP2, but maybe no risk alleles here, maybe 2 risk alleles here. And then we make an algorithm, which is just a way to say that we add them all together and we keep a running total of whether you have risk alleles and not a risk alleles. Beta just tells me which a risk allele, how big an effect it has. So this might have an effect of 2, and this an effect of 1, and this an effect of 3, and so on, and then add it all up, and that gives you a good idea of your overall chance for injury or overall chance for metabolizing coffee. And here's one example. You'll see this now as a graph because your score is continuous. The score, and for bone mineral density and fracture, we call it BOG, for bone mineral density, osteoporosis, genetic algorithm. It's a continuous score. And if you're over here at the low end, you have risk. And you can see that here, with this type of score, this type of genetic score, you would be at a 63% increased risk of fractures. And if you're over here, you would be at decreased risk of fracture compared to the median. Good luck with your test and have fun and train smart so you can play hard.